Well, so what they did is they went through the public data and they searched for randomized control trials that had randomized the adults to increase their total or omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid consumption for at least a year without other major interventions. So no blood pressure medication, no smoking control or other dietary interventions. Okay, so they're looking at increase of both total and omega-6 PUFAs. Now, most of the time, omega-6 PUFAs are from plant sources, but you can also get omega-3 PUFAs, which are from animal sources. So looking both at total and omega-6 kind of skews the data a little bit because you're not dividing it up between the plant and animal sources. And that's usually where like the distinction kind of lies between people. But regardless, let's move on. What other criteria did they use for searching trials? They had to make sure that these trials had an appropriate control group without the dietary intervention. So yeah, that's very important. You always want to be able to compare to the control group that didn't receive whatever the intervention was. And then of course they also looked for studies that reported hard coronary disease events. So hard events are either myocardial infarction, so heart attacks, heart attack related deaths, sudden deaths. They also had some exclusion criteria. They excluded studies if they were observational or non-randomized. Okay, like I said, the difference between interventional and observational is interventional has a higher impact and more reliable data. So when it was observational, they just excluded that, which is really good. And they tried to not include non-randomized trials because there's too much biasing that way when data is not randomized. They also excluded studies that tested mainly the omega-3 PUFA intervention. So this is good. When there was just a study with a reliance on only omega-3 PUFAs, they excluded those studies, but they do say they included ones that had the omega-6 and total. So it's not a perfect study, but it's all right. So they also excluded studies that had soft coronary heart disease endpoints. So this would be angina. Okay, and they did not include any commentaries, review articles, or duplicate publications of the same studies, which makes sense. Here's an interesting point that they include, which I think points out the major limitation of this study, is they included both feeding trials and trials that utilized dietary advice. And I think that's just very interesting that they decided to include both of those together, because it's so different to be actually providing meals for a population and knowing exactly what food they're consuming versus only providing dietary advice and having no idea what level of adherence to the advice is kept by the patient population. So it makes me question whatever results we can obtain from combining these two sets of data, because they're too different. In my mind, it's very hard to be able to compare these two. Okay, and additionally, they also say that they assessed study quality using a validated scale, and the scale included criteria relating to randomization, to blinding, and withdrawals and dropouts that are together summed up to generate an overall quality score between 0 and 5. Okay, so quality scores of 0 to 2 indicated lower quality trials, and then between 3 and 5 indicated high quality trials. Okay, that's good. That's good that they do that. Gives us an idea of which of the data to trust more. So what were the results? Here we go. Let's look at this very closely. So they identified randomized controlled trials that included a total of 1,042 coronary heart disease events among 13,600 participants. On average, the control group had about 5% of total energy intake be PUFA, and in the intervention group, that number was increased to about 15% of total energy intake. So once again, just highlighting how this is actually a huge increase in the intervention group of PUFA consumption compared to the control group. The control has on average 5%, and the intervention increases that to 15% of total energy. Here's another point from the authors. They say many of the trials had design limitations such as single blinding, inclusion of electrocardiographically defined clinical endpoints, or open enrollment. Okay, so again, I want to point out how what I really like about this study is the authors are always very open and clear with the limitations of this meta-analysis. As long as someone takes the time to read through the entire thing, they understand how much weight to put behind a study or behind the results of a study like this. One interesting thing when I mentioned about the quality scores, right? They gave quality scores between 0 and 5 on the 8 trials. Surprisingly, all trials had quality scores of either 2 or 3, right? So 2 was the lower quality, 3 belonged in the higher quality, although at the lower echelon. So they didn't really have any data that would be considered really high quality, such as a 4 or 5. So that's a little bit, should make your warning sign go off in, again, being able to put a lot of weight behind the results that we see here. But all in all, combining all trials, the pooled risk reduction for coronary heart disease events was 19%. This RR here is risk ratio, and it's 0.81, as you can see here, and I'll explain what that means. Basically, the 19% risk reduction is actually a relative risk reduction. It's not an absolute risk reduction. So let me just explain what the difference between an absolute risk reduction and a relative risk reduction is, and that way you'll understand what this actually means. So imagine, and I'm going to just make this up, but let's imagine the risk of coronary heart disease in the control group was 50%. It's not that high, it was much lower, but let's say it was 50% in the control group. Now, if we were to think that this was a 19% absolute risk reduction, then we would simply subtract 19 from 50 to get to 31%. So we would say, okay, the intervention group is 31% risk and the control group is 50% risk. But this was not an absolute 19% risk reduction. This was a relative risk reduction, which means that the risk for the intervention group was 81%, 0.81, 81% of the control, which means relatively 19% lower from the control. So in this case, if the control is 50%, relatively 19% lower than that would bring us actually down to 40%, not down to 31. So that's a big difference. Now, what are the absolute numbers that I'm talking about for these studies? Well, they don't actually provide them, and it's hard to calculate it because they don't say how many of the 13,000 participants were in the control and how many were in the intervention group. If I go through each of the 8 trials myself, I would be able to find that data, but the pool data is not provided here in this. They just say the total is 13,000. But if we look at the total risk between both groups, if we look at the percent that 1,000 out of 13,000 it's approximately around, I think, just below 8%. And if there's a 19% relative risk reduction in the intervention group, most likely that means that the control relative risk or absolute risk would have probably been in the high 8 to almost 9%, whereas the absolute risk for the intervention group would have been probably in the low 7% range. So if you look at the numbers that way, then the control, from the control down to the intervention, would have been a drop from, let's say, guessing or guesstimating from about 8.5% down to 7.5%. So it's a 1 to 2% difference in absolute numbers, but a 19% difference in relative risk numbers. So it's just a framing effect. Of course, 90% sounds a lot nicer than 1 or 2%. So keep that in mind, because oftentimes this is how data is presented. And to be charitable to the authors, it's probably because mostly academics are reading this data and they're not necessarily writing this for like a regular person who would not know the difference between relative and absolute risk reduction. But it's good to keep that in mind as we go through the study. So one more time, this RR is the risk ratio, which is usually written out as like a number close to 1, either below or above 1. So in this case, it's 0.81, meaning the intervention was 81% as likely as the control group, again, meaning a 19% relative risk reduction. If you look at the numbers like this for all the individual studies, it's nicely presented in this figure here. Here we have a kind of a graph where we can see a line that goes straight down the middle pointing to 1. So 1 RR, or relative risk, indicates that the relative risk of the intervention group would have been the same as the control group, meaning there was no benefit or risk. Okay? And if the RR value is less than 1, it means the risk of the intervention group would have been lower than the control group, which would have been beneficial, right? And so here we can see that all these 3 or 8 trials have an RR value below 1, all except one actually. There's one study that has an RR value above 1, and surprisingly, this study is actually the study with the largest number of participants. So altogether, all 8 studies combined to 13,600 participants, but one study actually makes up over 9,000 of that total. So it's a huge study, and in this one, the RR value, or the relative risk, is actually above 1, meaning that there's potentially a risk involved in this interventional diet where PUFA consumption is significantly increased. All right, so keep that in mind. And the second thing to look at is actually these lines that represent the confidence intervals. So we're given what the average relative risk number is, right? But we're also given a 95% confidence interval range within which the true value could be lying. And in all of the studies, 7 out of the 8 studies actually, so there's only one study where the confidence intervals do not include the relative risk of 1, meaning potentially there could be no improvement in coronary heart disease event outcome by increasing total PUFA consumption. So it's very interesting to kind of look at the data this way and see how, even though there seems to be some small benefit accruing in the intervention group, for all of these, it's not really statistically significant. And for the study with the largest number of participants, there's actually potentially a risk involved too. So when I saw this, it was very surprising. Okay, and now let's move on to a little bit, drill down on the data even a little bit more. So here the authors next go on to say that the median duration of all trials was 4.25 years. And among the 4 trials with the duration of less than that mean, less than 4 years, the pooled RR relative risk was 0.91, so only a 9% relative risk reduction. However, among the 4 trials with the duration of greater than 4.25 years, then the pooled relative risk was 0.73, meaning a 27% risk reduction. So that's very interesting. So what they're trying to say is, well, if you follow the diet for a longer period of time, there's clearly a stronger benefit. However, it's interesting to note that these are actually not statistically significant. They don't provide a p-value here for this data, which means that while the data could be suggesting some sort of effect, there's no statistical significance. And interestingly, if you look at the 4 trials that have a duration of less than 4.25 years, that's actually the majority of the participants. Remember, there was only 13,600 total participants, and the 4 trials that make up the ones that have less than 4.25 in duration, that makes up for, I believe, over 12,000. I went back and checked the numbers, over 12,000 of the 13.6 thousand people. And for those people, the relative risk reduction was quite low. In fact, within the confidence intervals, it was well within 1, indicating no improvement. And in fact, there was no statistical significance as there's no p-value provided. And then for the longer duration trials, that's only like 15 or 1,600 people compared to the over 12,000 in the previous group that I mentioned. And again, there's no p-value provided, suggesting no statistical significance. And this is what happens when you have small numbers. We always see a greater effect in small numbers because that's just the law of small numbers. That's why we don't trust results until we get a a larger data set that includes as many people as we possibly can to give us a true representation of what is actually going on. Okay, and then remember we mentioned that the quality of the data was like assessed, and they had given a score of either 2 or 3 to these 8 trials. Now they say for the 6 trials with a quality score of 2, so the 6 out of 8, most of the trials had a low quality score of 2. The relative risk was 0.78. So they actually saw a higher effect on the low quality data. And then for the 2 trials, only 2 trials out of the 8 with a quality score of 3, the relative risk was 0.91, meaning only a 9% relative risk improvement. So the high quality data basically shows not a huge amount of improvement. And in fact, the confidence interval, again, is well within 1, suggesting that possibly there's absolutely no improvement here at all. And again, there's no p-value provided for either one of these, meaning that these aren't statistically significant anyway. And then here's a really important part of the results section. In the secondary analysis, restricted to coronary heart disease mortality alone, so they didn't include any heart attacks. They looked at just the deaths. There were 855 events, and the pooled relative risk was 0.80, so 20%. So it's basically the same number that they saw for like both the heart attacks and the heart attack related deaths. But again, there's no p-value provided, meaning that this is not statistically significant. And if we look at the confidence interval, it's pretty close to 1, suggesting that, this number is meaningless. And then lastly, this is the most important, the damning part of the evidence, where they say evaluating total mortality due to all causes, which there were 2,472 events, the pooled relative risk was 0.98, almost 1. So there's absolutely no improvement in total mortality in the intervention group compared to the control group. So that's, very surprising. Like if the diet intervention is helping reduce the coronary heart disease related mortality, but causing some other sort of mortality increase, then is it really helping? We have to ask ourselves that. And again, in both these situations, there's no p-value provided, meaning this was not a statistically significant result. All right. And then the last 2 pieces of evidence here that I highlighted, there were only 2 trials out of the 8 that were double-blinded, and restricting the results to just these 2, we get another relative risk that's almost close to 1, meaning not a huge improvement in the intervention group. And again, no p-value provided, suggesting no statistical significance. So when you include the data when you restrict the data to be like the higher quality data, we don't see the same effect that we do when we look at everything all together. And then lastly, they talk about the 4 reports that provided meals, i.e. were feeding trials. The relative risk was 0.76, so a 24% relative risk reduction. And they do provide the p-value here, but sorry, I didn't mean to highlight everything. But the p-value is 0.08. And I think it's pretty funny that they include this, because any value above 0.05 is meaningless. Sometimes people like to include this to say like, oh, it was close to 0.05, so it's like trending towards statistical significance. Well, I'm sorry, that's just not like how we do statistics. Either is statistically significant or it's not. And even when you restrict the data to just include the trials that, like I said, would be the higher quality trials from earlier on, because they're actually providing the data so you know exactly what the people are eating, even then there is no statistical significance. And then when you do restrict it to the trials that just provided dietary advice, you still see a mild benefit about so our risk ratio is 0.84, meaning a relative 16% risk reduction. And now the p-value here is below 0.05. But again, the confidence interval is so close to 1, and this is such a small improvement that I think all this data together combined really invalidates the kind of the claims that this paper makes. But let's just go on quickly into some of the discussion points that the authors go into as well. They say, whereas nearly all these trials were insufficiently powered to detect a significant effect individually, The pooled results demonstrate a significant benefit of replacing PUFA for saturated fat on clinical coronary heart disease events. I think that's so funny to say that. So like, even though the individual studies themselves show no improvement whatsoever, if we pool all these differently done studies where like different patient groups are given different foods and the measurements are all done differently, but some of the outputs are kind of similar. So if we just combine it all together, then we do see a benefit. It's just, that's not very scientific at all. And I don't think they can really claim that there's really a benefit here. Hopefully I was able to make that clear by some of my critique that I presented. And they say that this is only the second dietary intervention together with consumption of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids or fish oil that has now been clearly demonstrated to reduce cardiovascular events in randomized controlled trials. And I would say that this has clearly not been demonstrated, as there's a lot of weakness in the data. And when you try to break down the data into like the more quality components of it, you find there's no statistical significance that could be shown. And in fact, the data that includes the trial with the largest number of people, you see a potential risk involved. So I don't know how they can make this statement, but they do. And in another thing that they say is, additionally, our analysis of heterogeneity indicates that longer term trials showed greater benefits, suggesting that the benefits of increasing PUFA consumption accrue over time. And this is clearly false because, like I said, first of all, their data showed no statistical significance for this, even though it seemed like there might be a benefit for the longer duration trials. The p-value was not low enough to show that statistical significance, and the amount of people that were actually in the study for long periods of time was very small compared to the total number of people in the study. So it's very hard to make a claim like that. I think the data could be interpreted either way. So it's just based on you to be able to analyze that on your own, though. And, you know, you have to question what the authors are saying, and don't necessarily have to believe what they say, but see if the data they provide supports their claims. And in my opinion, it does not. Okay, and then last part of the article, they do go over the limitations, which I do appreciate the fact that these authors are very honest and provide a lot of caveats to what they're presenting, which is very good. So they say many of the identified randomized trials in our meta-analysis had important design limitations. Some trials provided all or most meals, whereas other trials relied on dietary advice. Yeah, absolutely. This is a huge limitation. Like, it's really hard to look at this data and think of them as the same, where one data set, you know exactly what the people participating were eating, and in this one, you have no idea. You're just relying on the fact that they listened to the dietary advice you gave them. It's too hard to combine these two data sets. Several of these trials were not double-blinded. Yes, they were, which lowers the quality of the data, and the ones that were double-blinded showed no improvement. And they say this could overestimate the benefits of the intervention. Absolutely. The methods for estimating and reporting PUFA and saturated fat consumption in each trial varied as well. So if how it was done varies, then it makes less sense to combine these studies together, right? And here's another really important point that they point out, is that one of the trials also provided, in addition to the main advice of consuming soybean oil, to consume sardines, and they provided this to the intervention group. And sardines are full of omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, right? So the authors say, so the observed benefits may at least be partially related to the marine omega-3 PUFA rather than the total PUFA consumption. And this is an important point, because often it's the vegetable oils, the industrial seed oils, that are recommended as the heart healthy ones, right? So in this study, in this one study where it provides support for polyunsaturated fats, it potentially could be because of the marine omega-3 fat, not the omega-6 fat. So keep that in mind as well. And so the authors say, given these limitations, each individual trial, the quantitative pooled risk estimate should be interpreted with some caution. Yeah, absolutely. Like, even though we see some sort of effect here, take it with a grain of salt, interpret it with some caution. It's funny that they say that, because then they go on to not interpret it with caution later on in the paragraph. But that's neither here nor there. And then, oh, sorry, this is the very last thing. And I'm really surprised that the authors finish off with this in saying that their findings demonstrate reduction in coronary heart disease events and no evidence for increased risk in long-term trials utilizing PUFA consumption at very high levels. I don't know how they can say there's no evidence of increased risk when clearly the study with the largest number of participants showed a potential increased risk. But regardless, they say this suggests that current recommendations for the upper limit of PUFA consumption at 10% of total energy need to be revisited, particularly as PUFA appears to be the primary evidence-based replacement for saturated fatty acids. And I simply disagree with that. I think the evidence does not support it. There is clearly some evidence to show that there's a potential decrease in the number of coronary heart disease events in the intervention group. But when you look at the most quality data, it does not seem to support that. And then when you also look at the total deaths, total mortality, there is no difference. If you still die at the same rate, possibly those polyunsaturated fatty acids are causing other disease, and you're dying from cancer or whatever it may be. It doesn't matter. What matters is, does the intervention make you live a longer life? And if it does not, then there's no benefit to it, and it should not be the common mainstream recommendation.